August 1991. The Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, USA. A 35-year-old woman named Pam Reynolds is undergoing an operation to remove a lethal brain tumor. To survive the procedure, her heart monitor must flatline. The surgical team drops her body temperature to 16 degrees Celsius. They tape her eyes shut. They block her ears with small speakers playing loud, continuous clicking sounds to monitor brain activity. Finally, they stop her heart and drain the blood from her skull. The operation succeeds, but when Pam wakes up, she terrifies the attending physicians. She tells them she watched the entire procedure from above her own body. She accurately describes the specific shape of the bone-cutting saw used on her skull, comparing it to an electric toothbrush. She then repeats verbatim the exact dialogue spoken between the surgeons while her head was open. During those moments, her brain registered zero electrical activity. By every metric of modern medicine, Pam Reynolds was a corpse, and a dead brain cannot observe its own autopsy. Medical science relies on a strict biological law known as the dependence thesis. This diagram shows the core rule of that thesis. Every thought, memory, and conscious experience you have is entirely dependent on the physical circuitry inside your head. When a patient's heart stops, and that circuitry is starved of oxygen, those pathways shut down. Consciousness extinguishes. If the dependence thesis holds true, Pam's ability to observe her surgeons is a biological impossibility. To understand how she saw this, we must examine the exact space between life and death. In 1901, a physician named Dr. Duncan McDougall attempted to solve this mystery by physically weighing the human soul. Inside a hospital ward much like this one, McDougall set up industrial scales. He placed dying tuberculosis patients on these devices to calculate any sudden change in mass, the exact second they passed away. When one patient died, the scale registered an immediate drop of exactly 21 grams. The number made international headlines as the supposed physical weight of a soul leaving the body. Other scientists quickly reviewed the methodology. They proved the 21-gram drop was simply the sudden evaporation of sweat and water vapor from the lungs at the moment of expiration. Physical scales could not capture the afterlife. Researchers had to abandon the search for physical evidence and rely entirely on the subjective memories of patients who survived clinical death. In 1975, Dr. Raymond Moody compiled accounts from hundreds of these resurrected patients. He classified their memories under a term still used today: the near-death experience. The patients reported a remarkably consistent sequence of events. First, a sensation of passing through a long, dark tunnel. Next, hovering outside their physical bodies. And finally, encountering a brilliant being of light. But analyzing the data across different demographics revealed a glaring inconsistency. The specific entities these patients met depended entirely on where they grew up. Western patients routinely described meeting St. Peter at the pearly gates. In India, patients described being dragged before the clerks of Yamaraj, the Hindu god of death, who checked their names against clerical ledgers. These contradictory visions suggest that these experiences are not glimpses into an objective afterlife. They are custom hallucinations written by the patient's own cultural expectations. Psychologist Dr. Susan Blackmore approached these accounts not as spiritual visions, but as the symptoms of a failing biological machine. This diagram shows the human visual cortex. There is a high concentration of visual processing cells in the center of our vision, and far fewer on the periphery. When the brain is starved of oxygen during cardiac arrest, those peripheral cells fail first. The dense cluster of cells in the center begin firing randomly. To the patient, this optical glitch looks exactly like moving through a dark tunnel toward a bright light. The overwhelming sense of peace and the feeling of a life flashing before one's eyes are caused by a massive dump of endorphins and morphine released by the limbic system to manage extreme trauma. The U.S. Navy proved this biological mechanism entirely by accident. They placed healthy volunteers inside massive human centrifuges to test the limits of gravitational force. When the centrifuge spun fast enough, blood was forced away from the pilots' brains. As they lost consciousness, these perfectly healthy volunteers reported floating outside their bodies, traveling through dark tunnels, and feeling profound peace. No one in the centrifuge was actually dying. The door to the afterlife is simply the mechanical failure of an oxygen-starved brain. That biological breakdown explains the pilots, but it fails to explain the surgical record of Pam Reynolds. Endorphins and oxygen deprivation can cause hallucinations, but they cannot explain how a blindfolded woman with taped eyes knew her surgeons used a defibrillator to shock her heart exactly twice. They do not explain how she accurately identified the specific shape of a bone saw that remained hidden inside its sterile packaging until well after her brain activity had flatlined. To test if human consciousness can actually project outside the body, medical researchers launched the AWARE study. They monitored cardiac arrest patients across 15 different hospitals. They placed specific hidden images flat on high shelves near the ceiling of the emergency rooms. If a dying patient's consciousness actually floated above their body, they would easily see the image and identify it upon waking. After tracking over 2,000 patients, the data yielded no conclusive proof. The exact mechanics of how Pam Reynolds saw her own surgery remain a permanent crack in our understanding of human biology. We have mapped the cellular breakdown of the visual cortex and the chemical reactions of extreme trauma, but the exact threshold where consciousness finally vanishes into the dark is still a mystery. Since we cannot measure the other side, our only empirical data points back to the living. In Australia, palliative care nurses recorded the final thoughts of patients who knew they were running out of time. On their deathbeds, people do not dwell on their mistakes. The most common regret reported by dying patients is abandoning their dreams to live the life other people expected of them. The existence of a soul or a tunnel of light remains fiercely debated, but the present moment is a mathematical certainty. We only know for a fact that we have this single opportunity. We have to make it count and build our own heaven right here before the lights permanently go out.